Welcome to the Renaissance Woodworker. I'm your host, Shannon Rogers, and welcome into my shop. I've spent a lot of time trying to explain to people that building fundamental hand tool skills can really help your woodworking. And this goes doubly true for you electron murdering power tool fiends. There's always going to be a time, there's always going to be a board that's too wide for your joiner. There's always going to be a piece that's too small to safely run over a router table. Grab one or two planes and you can flatten that 24-inch wide board. Grab yourself a chisel or maybe a block plane and you can put a chamfer on that 1-inch tiny square piece of cherry. But here's the thing, the hand tool world in a lot of ways is just like the power tool world. We're seeing a lot of new hand tools hitting the market, a lot of great manufacturers making some great tools, but we're also seeing a lot of specialization in these tools. Planes that cut very specific joints, chisels that are tuned for very specific reasons. You can very quickly think, I need a whole bunch of tools. Even the power tool woodworker who recognizes they need a little bit of hand tools in their shop to handle these tough situations may think they need to have 20 different planes and a whole set of chisels. Here's the thing, all of those specialized tools, essentially they can boil down to a couple of very simple tools. One of which is a chisel. A hand plane is nothing more than a chisel held at a fixed angle. So I think really breaking down and looking at fundamental hand tool skills, like working with a chisel, can save your butt in so many ways. Now I say this all the time, and then I find myself thinking, well, what's a good example? Well, I'm working on this tool cabinet here, adding some finishing touches, and I realized that in order to put the hinge on this other door down here, I'm going to need to cut essentially a very long mortise, or really a double-blind rabbet here. I thought about this a little bit. I could probably use a mixture of saws and a rabbet plane, but ultimately I'm going to end up having to do some chopping with a chisel. And I started thinking about ways that I could make this work, and it occurred to me I'm spending so much time thinking about how I can make this work quickly and efficiently with some sort of plane when I could have already chopped it out just using the chisel. So I'm going to show you how I'll go ahead and chop out this really, really long mortise or a double-blind rabbet just using a chisel. So here's the situation. The hinge needs to go inside the cabinet here. I suppose with a forethought, before I assembled and glued up everything, I could have gotten in here a lot easier. The fact remains that it still would have been a double-blind mortise. I can't go through the end here because I've got a rail, and the hinge needs to stop right about here. So what I did is I laid the hinge in place just like any hinge mortise and traced around it with a knife, and I used a marking gauge here to run along the front edge here and knife in the outer dimensions of my hinge. And I've got a knife mark down here to mark the bottom edge. I've just got a cheap firmer chisel here, and it's been ground relatively low to act as a nice paring chisel. This is something that I paid, I think, about $5 for at a flea market. I actually did a video on this a long time ago about setting up and restoring a vintage chisel, if you want to check that out. I'm going to come in here, and with this knife line in place, I want to make very light cuts to kind of pare out like a V shape in the back here along my knife line. I'm lifting the chisel handle up a fair amount, so I'm diving down and creating a V cut. If I come at a really low angle, it'll still work, but then I don't have much of a depression. Ultimately, what I'm trying to do is create a physical wall that the chisel will drop into. If it's really shallow, it's kind of hard to get it to register, but if you've got a definite V, the chisel will just kind of pop in there and it locks in place. So gripping the chisel, I'm left-handed, so I'm always going to be pushing my left hand, my dominant hand will be on the handle. My right hand, or for you righties out there, your left hand, is going to choke up on the chisel, and I'll put my finger right here on the edge and kind of act as a fence. While I'm pushing with my left hand, I'm kind of pulling back with my right hand and keeping things very much under control. That way you don't lose control of the whole thing and have it skid out across. This cut is very shallow, and if you lose control, you're liable to just gouge up the inside of your case very quickly. I'm just going to work my way down. The entire length of the piece here. Last thing I'm going to do here is also come down to the end and do the same thing on that stop cut down there. So now I've got a very definite wall, and the chisel just kind of slides and pops right into place. Now I want to kind of chop down a little bit. Now, as I said before, this chisel is set up with a 20-degree angle. It's set up to be a paring chisel. It's not meant to be whacked with a mallet. The low bevel really makes the edge a little too delicate, too fragile for chopping. So I've got another bench chisel that's actually set a 25-degree primary bevel, and it's got a 30-degree secondary bevel. So it's got a lot more stoutness to it. I can drop this in that line I've created. Again, it just clicks in there. And I'm going to chop down. I don't want to go too deep because remember, I'm working with the grain here. I could split the piece out. A cherry is going to be a little bit more resilient than some of your more open grain woods. But I am going to chop down a little bit further here, a little bit deeper, so I've got kind of a stop cut to prevent any split from running down the length. Now, the other thing I'll mention that I forgot earlier is you want to create a depth line along this edge that is equal to the thickness of your hinge leaf, how deep you want this whole thing to go. That's going to give you a reference point that you can work from. I'm just going to continue chopping down here. Now, as you work your way down, you always want to be referencing part of your chisel in the area you just chopped out. I'll usually go about a third to almost a half of the chisel. I'll set it in that line, and that guides it and keeps it in line. The little relief cuts we made will help as well, but this is just kind of redundancy, if you will. Start it in that kerf and move your way down. Now right here at the very end, I need to chop in here to sever this out, especially because I'm really close to the end of the piece here. If I try to set the flat against it, I can't chop straight down. So I'll set the bevel against it and lift it up so that the bevel is straight up and down here. It's parallel to this case piece. And I'll chop right down there. So now I have outlined everything. And you can get pretty aggressive here and come in along the edge. And this is where that gauge line on the edge can really be helpful. I don't want to try to take off too much at this point, so I'm going to follow the rule of halves. And I want to try to remove half the waist and then remove half the waist again. And I'll pop out that first chip. And what I really want to do is focus on a little section right down here at the end and get it to final depth and final size. I'm going to switch over to my paring chisel. I could keep working with this bench chisel, but because I frankly have the luxury of having a paring chisel, I'm going to go ahead and use it. It slides through the wood a lot easier with just hand pressure alone. I just popped my my chisel right in, just put the corner right in my gauge line and pushed it forward. With just the corner, I've got such a small amount of steel trying to push forward, it very easily just rides right in there and peels up a chip. And you can, now, I can set my chisel right on that section in the front that I know is at depth. Well, almost. Okay. It's right at depth, and I can just push back. And sometimes it's just kind of a little wiggle motion. And if you look closely right in here, I've got a very clean line, clean shoulder, as soon as I blow the chips out of there, and it's nice and smooth and flat. I can now use this as my reference surface to pare down the rest of the way. Now again, I don't want to try to remove this all at once. I could come back with a stouter chisel and the mallet and pound my way out, but I actually find I've got more control if I just pare. Again, that same motion where I am pushing with one hand, kind of pulling back with the other. I will pare away the first part of the waist, and then as I get closer, I'll reference the flat of the chisel on the spot that's already to depth. So I've got a corner here, and I'm going to pivot into the work. And I can remove that waist until I feel that I've got a nice flat surface. When I register the chisel in there, I can slide it back and forth, and I can feel that I've got a little bit of a hump right there in the middle. And actually, if I look on my edge, the camera's not going to pick up this fine detail, but if I look right on the edge, I can see a little bit of my gauge line. And there we go, nice and flat. In the interest of time, I am going to come back to the chisel and the mallet. Try to hog out as much of the waste as I can very quickly here. Okay, there's the bulk of it roughed out. And here's an opportunity where you could probably speed some things up a little bit by coming in with one of these specialty tools like a router planes. One of the reasons I recommend router planes is, you know, the first joinery plane or joinery tool, hand tool that you buy. But for the purpose of this exercise, we want to stick to using just the chisel. And we're going to reference it off the, well, reference space we've got down here. Feel that corner nice and flat on that reference space, and basically just extend that reference space down. And I'm cutting with maybe a quarter of the width of the chisel at this point. 3/4 of the chisel is referenced back on the known flat surface. And you want to have pressure with your thumb down on that surface, really making sure that you're not digging deeper. You're staying in that same plane. And with just that small amount of chisel actually doing the cutting, there's very little effort involved to get the whole thing to cut. I didn't chop quite as much off on this end, so I've got a little bit more to pare away. But you get to the point where you can really feel the bottom of that mortise, kind of feel how your chisel, the flat of your chisel, is reacting to the wood, where the high spots are, where the humps are, and really how much you need to remove. Where this will go wrong, where a lot of people have trouble when they first try this, is trying to remove too much material at once. Paring is a delicate action. You're not removing very much wood. So if you're really having to muscle it, either your chisel's dull, take that out of the equation. If you're having to really put a lot of effort behind it, you're trying to remove way too much wood. So now I'm pretty much to depth. So what I'm going to do, got a few fuzzy spots, and it's not the end of the world because the hinge is going to go over this, but I'm going to come back and kind of skew the chisel and very lightly run it down the wood. And what this does is it kind of picks up on those little high spots you may have, and it just shaves them back. If you can see, I'm getting these kind of really little curlicue shavings, and that's what happens with this skewing action of the chisel. You get a nice clean cut, but it's also very delicate, and it will pick up those little imperfections in the surface. Now you can grab yourself a straight edge. Side of this chisel is straight enough here. You can ride it along, and you can see, am I flat? I can feel I'm a little high right there. Yep, sure enough, I set the chisel down flat and I rock it in, I'm picking up a chip on the edge because I'm just a little bit too high. And then it dips down again at the end. So, and don't underestimate your fingers here. They can really feel these little imperfections. Now, obviously, if my initial chopping didn't go deep enough, I would need to come back and kind of clean this up. But I think I got deep enough that I've got a nice clean shoulder here. And at this point, this rabbet's done. I'm ready, rabbet, mortise, whatever you want to call it. I'm ready to come back and drop the hinge, which is already attached to the door. I'm going to drop that hinge right in place, and I've got a perfect hinge mortise using nothing but a chisel. So if you learn anything from watching this video, I hope that it's that you don't need a whole bunch of tools. A couple of flea market special chisels, a plane or two, maybe a saw, and you're able to produce some really very nice work. And if anything, we get over this myth that we need all these tools in order to get started. Getting started is one or two tools away. And it's all about getting in the shop and actually learning these fundamental skills that are going to pay such amazing dividends when you run across little issues like a double-blind, super long rabbet or hinge mortise. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.